Starved for justice. The food riots that shook Attica prison. The night the trays came back empty. The sun was just beginning to rise over Attica prison when something strange happened, something that every officer on duty still talks about today. A guard pushed a metal food cart down the long hallway of A block. Breakfast was supposed to be the usual: powdered eggs, a slice of bread, and a small cup of watery oatmeal. But when he opened the first slot to pass the tray through, an inmate shoved the tray right back out. But it slammed onto the floor. Then another tray came flying out from the next cell. And another. And another. Within seconds, the entire block exploded in noise. Metal trays crashing, fists banging on doors, inmates shouting at the top of their lungs. "We are not animals. We need real food. Enough is enough." The officers froze. They had seen fights. They had seen lockdowns. But this was different. This was organized. This was angry. This was the beginning of the Attica food riots. And no one, not the guards, not the warden, not even the inmates themselves, knew how far it was about to go. The hunger before the storm. Before the riot, the food at Attica had already reached a breaking point. Meals were small, cold, and often spoiled before they even made it to the cells. In winter, milk froze into slush. In summer, meat smelled strange. Bread came hard as a rock. And sometimes, the kitchen mixed old leftovers into new food just to stretch supplies. Many inmates tried to complain, but their voices never made it past the chow hall doors. In cell 14, a man named Reggie Carter, serving time for robbery, kept a small notebook. Every day he wrote down the meals. He wrote notes like, "Sour potatoes again. Bread moldy. Meat gray. Stomach pain after lunch." Reggie wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't loud. He wasn't even part of a gang. But he knew one thing for sure. If we don't speak up, nothing will change. Down the tier, another inmate named Miguel Santos worked in the prison kitchen. Miguel saw things others didn't. He saw how food was stored, how it was cooked, and how little the prison cared about the quality. He once whispered to Reggie, "Man, they feeding y'all stuff I wouldn't give to a stray dog." Miguel wanted to help, but if officers caught him talking, he would lose his kitchen job. And in prison, a job meant survival. So he stayed quiet, until the day the guards started cutting food portions even smaller. The change was sudden: half scoops, tiny servings, cups barely filled halfway. The prison claimed it was because of budget issues, but the inmates knew something else. They were being starved into obedience. Rumors began to spread. "They want us weak. They want us silent. They're trying to punish the whole block." Tensions rose. Men argued more. Some fainted from hunger. Others hid bread under their beds, afraid the next day would be worse. But the moment that really pushed everyone over the edge happened 3 days before the riot. Reggie opened a tray and found something moving inside his food. A bug. He stared at it, tiny legs, alive, crawling. He lifted the tray to show the guard, but the officer just shrugged and said, "Eat around it." And that was the spark. When word spread, the entire block stopped eating. Not because they wanted to protest, but because they were simply too disgusted to put the food in their mouths. A silent hunger grew deeper and deeper, not just in their stomachs, but in their patience. Something was coming. Something big. They could all feel it. And when the next morning's trays arrived, the whole prison would hear the response. The trays didn't just get rejected, they came flying back. This was the moment Attica realized. Hunger can turn into anger, and anger can turn into a riot. The breakfast that broke Attica. The next morning started like any other, but the men in A block were wide awake long before sunrise. There was a quiet tension, like the air right before a storm hits. Reggie sat on the edge of his bunk. His stomach ached from hunger, but his mind was sharp. Miguel, over in the kitchen, watched officers hurry the cooks, shouting at them to move faster. But the food looked even worse than yesterday: eggs watery enough to spill, bread so stale it snapped like wood. Miguel whispered under his breath, "If they send this to the block, it's over." The cart rolls in. At exactly 6 a.m., Officer Daniels pushed the breakfast cart down A block. Usually, inmates shouted, joked, or grumbled as food arrived. But today? Total silence. Daniels felt uneasy. He looked at the trays, tiny servings, barely half full. He already knew the men wouldn't like it. He stopped at the first cell, slid open the slot, and pushed the tray in. A second later, slam. The tray shot back out and clattered across the floor. Daniels blinked. What the? He tried again at the next cell. Bang. Another tray thrown back. By the third cell, the entire block came alive. Enough. We won't eat this trash. We want real food. Men kicked their cell doors, metal smashing against metal and echoing down the long hallway. Trays flew out so fast that Daniels had to back away as food spilled across the floor. The noise grew louder, a deep roar rolling through A block. Officers rushed in, shouting orders. Lock it down. Stop banging. Anyone throw a tray again will be punished. But the men didn't stop. They weren't scared. They were fed up. The block units join in. Across the prison, word traveled fast, far faster than the guards expected. B block heard the banging first. Then C block. Then D. Each unit started shouting through the vents, the pipes, the walls. We hear you. We're with you. Food is a right. For the first time in months, Attica's inmates, different races, different gangs, different backgrounds, were united. Not for violence. Not for trouble. But for something as simple and human as food. The guards lose control. Inside the control booth, Officer Marks hit the alarm button. The siren wailed across the prison. But it didn't stop the banging. If anything, it made it louder. Reggie shouted from his cell. We're not fighting anyone. We just want food that won't make us sick. Other voices rose. Talk to us. We want the warden. Fix the food. Guards patrolled the tiers, but none dared to open a cell door. They knew the men weren't attacking, but they also knew the anger could turn physical at any second. One officer muttered to another. If this spreads, we won't be able to stop it. He was right, because something was about to happen that no one expected. Something that turned a loud protest into a full-scale food riot. The moment the trays hit the windows, a single inmate on the lower tier picked up his tray and hurled it at the thick glass window overlooking the yard. A second followed. Then a third. Dozens of trays smashed against the glass like a wave of metal thunder. From outside, other inmates in the yard saw the trays hitting the windows and started shouting back. Attica! Attica! It was no longer just a block protest. It was the entire prison waking up. A hunger strike had turned into a standoff. A standoff was turning into a riot. And all it took was a bad breakfast. When hunger turned into fire, the sound inside Attica didn't feel human anymore. It rumbled. It shook. It echoed through every concrete wall like the prison itself was alive. Inside A block, the officers backed away slowly, unsure of what the inmates would do next. None of the men had weapons. None had broken out of their cells. But their anger, loud, united, unstoppable, was more frightening than any fight the guards had ever seen. Reggie stood at his door, gripping the bars. We are hungry, not violent, he shouted. But when hundreds of voices join together, even peaceful words can feel like thunder. Across the tier, another inmate yelled, Open the doors and talk to us. But the officers didn't answer. They were waiting for orders from above. And while they waited, the situation grew worse. The yard erupts. Out in the prison yard, the commotion reached the outdoor units. Inmates who had been walking laps or doing morning workouts paused and stared at the windows of A block. A food tray slammed against the glass a second time. And the yard erupted. Men rushed to the fences, banging on the metal, chanting in one rising voice. Food. 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 It wasn't a chant of violence. It was the chant of men who felt ignored for too long. The officers posted in the watchtowers looked down nervously. The yard gates were secure, but the crowd kept growing. The warden hears the news. Upstairs, in the administration office, Warden Hawkins was in the middle of his morning coffee when an officer burst in. Sir, he said, breathing hard, we've got a problem in A block. How big? the warden asked. The officers swallowed hard. Big enough that the whole prison might join them. The warden stood up immediately. This wasn't just a complaint. This wasn't just a disturbance. This was an uprising, and in Attica, uprisings could turn deadly fast. Hawkins grabbed his radio and barked orders. Double the guards. Lock down every unit. No one moves until I say so. But he made one mistake. He didn't address the food. He didn't address the hunger. He addressed only control. And the inmates noticed. Inside A block, chaos builds. Back inside A block, the men realized something important. The prison wasn't listening. No officer came to speak. No one addressed the food issue. No one tried to negotiate. Instead, more guards poured in wearing riot helmets, holding shields, gripping batons. Miguel, still in the kitchen, watched them march by with wide eyes. They think this is a fight, he whispered. But it's not, unless they make it one. Meanwhile, Reggie could feel the tension shifting. The men around him weren't just angry anymore. They felt betrayed. If the prison ignored their hunger today, what would they ignore tomorrow? The breaking point. A young inmate named Jackson, only 19 years old, was the one who finally snapped. Jackson had been one of the quiet ones. Skinny. Always hungry. He hadn't seen his family in months. He barely slept. He shook with frustration as he yelled, "We are starving in here." He threw his tray at the wall. Then his cup. Then he started kicking his door. Other inmates followed. Bang, bang, bang. The entire block became a drum. The noise traveled through pipes, vents, and concrete until it hit C block, where the most frustrated inmates were housed. They didn't just shout. They didn't just bang. They started tearing their sheets into ropes, tying them together, and tossing them out the bars. A signal. A sign that they were done waiting. The first fire. Then it happened. In D block, an inmate lit a piece of paper on fire, using a match stolen long ago from a maintenance cart. He tossed the burning paper into a trash bin filled with old newspapers. The flames rose fast. Smoke filled the hallway. Officers shouted for extinguishers. Alarms blared. And word spread like lightning. They're burning stuff in D block. The whole prison's moving. It's starting. It's really starting. Reggie pressed his forehead against the bars. This wasn't what he wanted. This wasn't the plan. But once a prison erupts, no one controls the fire. Not the guards. Not the warden. Not even the inmates who started it. Hunger had turned into chaos. Chaos was turning into a riot. And Attica prison was about to face one of the loudest, angriest days in its history. The day Attica stopped breathing. Smoke drifted through the hallways like a warning. Not thick enough to choke anyone yet, but enough for every officer and inmate to know something dangerous was happening. Attica prison, cold, strict, and tightly controlled, suddenly felt like it had no rules at all. Guards rushed in every direction. Inmates shouted through vents, banging for attention. The smell of burnt paper rolled under cell doors and traveled through the pipes. But the most important thing wasn't the fire. It was the silence that followed. Not in the blocks, but in the control room. Because for the first time all morning, the warden had no idea what to do. The warden's first mistake. Warden Hawkins stood in front of the big glass window overlooking A block and watched the chaos rise. He didn't see weapons. He didn't see a breakout. He didn't see a plan to hurt anyone. All he saw were angry, hungry men demanding to be treated like human beings. But instead of listening, he snapped. Lock them down harder. I want every door sealed. No movement, none. The officers hesitated. They knew locking down hungry, furious inmates was like trapping fire in a box. It won't stay quiet. It will explode. But orders were orders. Within minutes, they shut every gate and sealed every hallway. Except one. The kitchen hallway. Miguel was still inside, staring at the breakfast trays the inmates rejected. In the kitchen, workers whispered, "They're not gonna fix the food? They think force will solve this?" Miguel closed his eyes and shook his head. This is only gonna get worse. The blocks unite. Across the prison, inmates began shouting to each other through vents and pipes. A block, they're starving us. B block, stand together. C block, no food, no peace. D block, Attica, Attica. Even inmates who hated each other, black, white, Latino, gang members, loners, shared the same hunger and the same anger. For the first time in years, the prison stood as one voice. The second fire. The small fire in D block wasn't enough to trigger a full emergency response yet. But then something bigger happened. In C block, an inmate shoved a stack of old bedding through the bars and set it on fire using sparks from a broken light fixture. The flames rose quickly, licking the walls and sending thick gray smoke upward. Alarms screamed. Lights flashed. Sprinklers burst from the ceiling, raining water down the corridor. Instead of calming things down, it made the shouting louder. The sound of water hitting steel mixed with the banging of fists and trays created a storm of noise. Now the prison wasn't just angry. It was panicking. Reggie makes a choice. Reggie watched smoke drift across the tier and felt his heart pounding. He wasn't trying to start a riot. He wasn't trying to create chaos. He only wanted decent food. But now, the prison was spinning out of control. He grabbed the bars of his door and shouted, not in anger, but in desperation. Stop. Stop the fire. Everyone stop. But the noise swallowed his voice. No one heard him. Except one. A guard named Collins, one of the few who treated inmates with basic respect, hurried past Reggie's cell. Carter, he yelled. Tell the men to calm down. Reggie shouted back. We will calm down when the warden talks to us. Collins paused. He knew Reggie was right. Ignoring the inmates had caused the explosion. Collins ran to the control booth and said, Sir, we need to talk to them, not fight them. But Warden Hawkins shook his head. No negotiations. They eat what we give. They follow orders. Collins lowered his eyes. That decision would cost them everything. The standoff begins. In A block, the noise suddenly dropped. The men weren't tired. They weren't giving up. They were waiting. The entire tier stood silently at their doors, staring at the guards. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of decision. They would no longer take food that made them sick. They would no longer accept being ignored. And they were not going to back down. Reggie looked around and felt something shift in his stomach. Not hunger, but realization. The food riot wasn't ending. It was only beginning. Attica prison was about to witness something no one expected. The peaceful protest, turning into a battle for basic human rights. And by the time the sun set, the warden would lose control of the prison completely. When the prisoners took control, the sun climbed higher over Attica prison, but inside the walls, daylight barely mattered. Smoke drifted through vents. Water from the sprinklers puddled on the floors. Officers shouted into radios that brought no solutions. And across every block, the inmates stood shoulder to shoulder, united by hunger, frustration, and the simple need to be heard. Everything felt like it was building toward one breaking point. And it came at exactly 10:42 a.m. The moment the gates failed. In A block, Reggie watched 3 officers rush toward the main hallway gates, pulling heavy chains to reinforce them. The metal groaned, then snapped. Not because inmates broke it. Not because anyone pulled on it. But because the gate had been old for years. And today, under pressure, it finally gave up. The gate swung open an inch. Just an inch. But in a prison that tense, an inch was all it took. A roar erupted from the block. The gate is open. Move. Move. We can talk to the warden now. Inmates didn't rush out violently. They didn't attack officers. They simply surged forward to be heard. The guards panicked. Shields up. Batons ready. But the inmates raised their hands and shouted, We don't want to fight. We want decent food. Yet the fear in the guards' eyes was enough to spark something uncontrollable. The stampede of no return. In C block, the sight of inmates moving freely in A block caused panic. Mistaking the peaceful march for an escape attempt, guards slammed the emergency alarm. The loud siren blared through every unit, and the inmates, already on edge, became even more agitated. Windows shook. Metal beds rattled. The prison felt like it was shaking. A young inmate screamed. "They're coming to crack skulls. Run!" And just like that, a peaceful march turned into a stampede. Dozens of inmates rushed through the open gate, slipping on wet floors, shouting to each other. "Don't let them lock us in. We want to talk. No more rotten food." Even Reggie, who wanted peace, was swept up in the movement. He pressed against the crowd, trying to keep people calm. Miguel, just released from the kitchen as officers evacuated it, ran along the hallway and spotted Reggie. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he shouted. Reggie nodded, breathless. "We just want to be heard." But the prison was too loud for reason. The control room freezes. Inside the control booth, officers watched the cameras with disbelief. Hundreds of inmates were marching, not attacking, not rioting randomly, but moving together with one purpose. Still, the warden saw only one thing: loss of control. He grabbed his radio. "Riot squad into A block. Full gear." One officer hesitated. "Sir, they haven't hurt anyone." Hawkins snapped back. "Deploy them." It was the wrong choice. The worst choice. The one choice that guaranteed everything would explode. The prisoners take hostages. The riot squad moved in, shields up, helmets down, batons ready. The inmates froze for a split second. Then fear hit them like lightning. Not fear of punishment. Not fear of lockdown. Fear of getting beaten for speaking up. A man at the front shouted, "Don't let them hit us." Another yelled, "Grab them before they grab us." And then it happened. Inmates reached out, not to hurt, but to stop the riot squad from charging. They pulled 3 officers away from the group, holding them still, surrounding them to prevent violence. It wasn't a planned attack. It wasn't revenge. It was a desperate attempt to keep the riot squad from storming in. Reggie pushed through the crowd, raising his arms. "No one hurt them." Miguel backed him up. "We are not killers." The prisoners circled the officers, not as enemies, but as bargaining chips. They didn't want to kill. They didn't want to torture. They didn't want a war. They wanted the warden to listen. The warden finally speaks, too late. When Hawkins heard that officers had been taken, his face went pale. For the first time all morning he felt fear, not for himself, but for what he knew would come next. Negotiators arrived. State officials were called. Reporters began gathering outside the prison walls. Attica prison was now the center of a storm. Reggie, exhausted and trembling, yelled toward the control booth. "We want fair food. We want clean meals. We want to be treated like humans." The warden finally stepped up to the microphone. His voice cracked as he said, "We're ready to talk." But it was too late. The inmates were in control now. The guards were surrounded. The prison was on lockdown. And Attica had become the site of one of the most intense standoffs in American prison history. All because of food. All because men were tired of starving. The standoff that shook New York. For the first time in Attica's history, the power had shifted. Not to violence. Not to weapons. But to hunger, and to the voices of men who had been ignored for far too long. Outside the walls, reporters gathered like vultures. Helicopters hovered overhead. Families of inmates stood anxiously by the fences, trying to understand what was happening behind the cold concrete. Attica had become a world with no rules. The yard becomes their meeting place. By midday, inmates from multiple blocks managed to push through unsecured gates and gather in the huge prison yard. Hundreds of men, black, white, Latino, stood together. Not fighting. Not rioting for chaos. Just standing. Waiting. Watching the towers. The 3 officers held inside A block were alive and unharmed, surrounded by inmates who protected rather than attacked them. Reggie looked around the yard and felt the weight of it all. "This is bigger than us," he whispered to Miguel. "This is Attica waking up." Miguel nodded, eyes scanning the yard. "They ain't gonna ignore us today." The prison brings in negotiators. Around 1:15 p.m., the first negotiator arrived. Deputy Commissioner Raymond Keene. He walked into the yard with a megaphone, voice trembling as he called out, "We want to resolve this peacefully." A wave of murmurs rippled through the inmates. Reggie stepped forward, speaking loud enough for the yard to hear. "We want to talk too." And that moment, the moment the inmates agreed to negotiate, stopped the situation from becoming a massacre. At least for now. The inmates make their demands. Under the watchtowers, with rifles pointed down at them, a small group of inmate spokesmen formed. Reggie was pushed toward the front, not because he wanted to, but because many trusted him. Miguel stood beside him. One man from D Block shouted, "Food first. Fix the food." Another yelled, "Clean kitchens." A third added, "We want more than trash on a tray." Reggie raised his hands to silence the crowd. When everyone settled, he spoke clearly. "We want real food. Food that's not spoiled. Food that doesn't make us sick. Food we can trust." His voice echoed across the yard. "We also want bigger portions. Clean water. And a kitchen run by people who actually care about health." The crowd roared in agreement. Reggie continued, "We're not asking for luxury. We're asking for dignity." Even the hostage officers, shaken, pale, and scared, nodded silently. They had eaten the same cafeteria food. And they knew the inmates were right. The negotiators promised change. Deputy Commissioner Keene lifted the megaphone. "We hear you. We understand your concerns. We promise to improve the food situation. But first, we need the officers released." The yard fell silent. Reggie looked at Miguel. Miguel looked back. If they released the hostages now, the prison might ignore the demands again. But if they kept them, things could turn deadly. Reggie closed his eyes. He wasn't a leader by choice, but hunger had made him one. He turned to the deputy and said, "We will not harm the officers. But we need real promises. Not words. Not excuses. Proof." The crowd roared, "Proof! Proof! Proof!" Keene swallowed. He knew this wasn't a negotiation he could escape with empty promises. The warden loses control completely. Inside the administration building, Warden Hawkins stormed around his office like a trapped bull. "I never should have allowed them into the yard," he shouted. "This is MY prison." But no one listened anymore. The state was involved now. Reporters were outside. Negotiators were in the yard. And the inmates were more organized than anyone expected. For the first time in his career, the warden realized he wasn't in control. The night approaches. As the sun began to set, the yard grew quieter. Not peaceful, just tired. Men who hadn't eaten since yesterday sat on the ground, arms around their knees, waiting for the state to act. Miguel whispered, "They're stalling. They want us weak." Reggie clenched his jaw. "Then we stand strong." The smell of smoke from earlier fires still lingered. The sound of helicopters echoed overhead. The spotlight from the towers lit the yard like a stadium. This wasn't just a food protest anymore. This was a historic standoff. One that would decide whether inmates were treated like human beings, or whether Attica would descend into darkness. And deep down, Reggie knew. The real fight hasn't even started yet. The longest night in Attica. Night at Attica prison was usually silent, cold, dark, and heavy with routine. But this night felt alive. Helicopters buzzed overhead like angry insects. Spotlights swept across the yard, making every inmate feel exposed. Officers paced the rooftops with rifles, their shadows long and tense. The inmates, gathered tightly in the yard, sat or stood in clusters. Some whispered. Some prayed. Some stared into the distance, wondering how a fight over food had turned into a statewide emergency. And in the center of it all, Reggie and Miguel stayed awake, watching the negotiators building like hawks. They knew something wasn't right. They could feel it in their bones. The cold night meeting. Around 9 p.m., a guard approached the yard fence with a flashlight and called out, "Carter, Miguel, come forward. Negotiators want to talk." Reggie and Miguel exchanged a tense look. Inside a small, fenced-off area at the edge of the yard, state officials waited with clipboards and radios, their breath fogging in the cold air. Deputy Commissioner Keene leaned forward. "We want to resolve this safely. Tell us your demands again." Reggie spoke slowly, clearly. "We want better food, safe food. We want clean kitchens. We want a review of the rotten meals you've been giving us. And we want you to promise, on paper, changes we can see. Miguel added, and we want medical checks for the guys who got sick from spoiled food. The officials wrote everything down. Then came the part Reggie feared. And the hostages? When will you release them? A negotiator asked. Reggie stood firm. They stay unharmed. But we can't release them until we see real steps toward change. We need proof, not promises. Keene exhaled slowly. He knew the inmates weren't being unreasonable. But the pressure from Albany, the state capital, was intense. The governor wanted this resolved. Preferably by morning. The infighting begins. Just outside the negotiation tent, officers argued with each other. One yelled, "We need to storm the yard and end this." Another shot back, "You storm it, you'll get people killed." The rising anger among guards matched the tension among inmates. Miguel whispered to Reggie, "The guards are divided." Reggie nodded. "So are we." Division among the inmates. In the yard, not everyone agreed on how to move forward. Some inmates were patient. "We hold steady. Let them negotiate." Others were furious. "No. They're playing us. They're waiting until we're weak." A large man from D Block, known as Stone, stood on a bench and shouted, "We need more than food. We need respect. We need rights." A smaller inmate yelled back, "This started about food, not war." Tensions rose inside the inmate group. Reggie stepped between them. "If we fight each other, we lose. If we panic, we lose. We stay calm. We stay focused. This is about survival." His voice steadied the crowd, but only for a moment, because the night was long, cold, and uncertain. The hostages speak. At midnight, one of the guarded officers, Officer Daniels, looked directly at Reggie through the bars. His voice shook. "Carter, I know the food is bad. I know you're not trying to hurt us. But you need to know something." Reggie leaned closer. Daniels swallowed hard. "The warden, he's not planning to negotiate. They're building a team. A tactical team." Miguel's eyes widened. "A raid?" Daniels nodded. "They think you're all too tired to resist by morning." Reggie felt his stomach twist. Miguel whispered, "They're waiting for us to starve before they strike." The words hit every inmate who overheard. The cold night suddenly felt colder. State troopers arrive. Around 2:30 a.m., the sound of engines rolled through the night. Multiple buses. Heavy trucks. Footsteps. Lots of them. The inmates watched from the yard as a long line of state troopers marched toward the prison gates in full riot armor. Shields. Helmets. Gas masks. Rubber bullet rifles. Miguel whispered, "They're gearing up." Reggie clenched his fists. "We have one chance left. We need to convince them we're negotiating in good faith." But convincing the negotiators was one thing. Convincing the governor, the man watching this unfold from hundreds of miles away, was another. The night that wouldn't end. By 4:45 a.m., most inmates were trembling with exhaustion. Not from fear. Not from cold. But from hunger. Some hadn't eaten in almost 36 hours. Some had dizzy spells. Some lay curled on the ground, too weak to stand. Miguel whispered, "We can't hold out like this much longer." Reggie looked across the yard at the rows of troopers assembling behind fences. "If morning comes and things haven't changed." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The sun would rise soon. And when it did, Attica would face a choice. Or attack. Either way, someone would break. And the food riot, the protest that began over spoiled eggs and stale bread, was now seconds away from turning into something far more dangerous. When hunger spoke louder than walls. As the first light of morning touched the razor wire above Attica prison, the world finally saw the truth. This wasn't just a riot. This wasn't chaos for the sake of chaos. This was a warning, a message carved out of hunger, frustration, and years of being ignored. Men who had almost nothing used the only thing they had left: their voices, their unity, their refusal to be silent. The food at Attica had been the last straw. a symbol of everything broken in the system. Rotten meals, tiny portions, sickness seen as normal, complaints tossed aside like crumbs on a dirty tray. And when people are pushed that far, when dignity is stripped away, even the smallest spark can start a fire. Reggie, Miguel, Jackson, and hundreds of others didn't ask for luxury. They didn't ask for special treatment. They asked for basic human rights, food that was safe, clean, and enough to survive. But the system didn't listen until the noise became too loud to ignore. Until the gates shook. Until the yard filled. Until the whole world turned to look at Attica and ask, how did it get this bad? The standoff didn't end because of strength. It didn't end because of force. It ended because even the people in power realized something simple. When men are starved, they will eventually stand up. When men are ignored, they will eventually unite. And when a system breaks them long enough, they will eventually break the silence. Attica's food riots became a turning point, not just for the prison, but for conversations about humanity behind bars across the country. It showed the world that punishment should never mean poison, that safety should never mean starvation, that justice should never mean suffering. And long after the smoke cleared, after the tension faded, after the men returned to their cells, one truth remained. Sometimes, the fight for justice doesn't begin with a weapon. Sometimes, it begins with an empty tray.